Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you, and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we take a look at the Delhi edition of today's The Hindu newspaper and take a look and analyze the important articles relevant for your examination. While discussing these particular articles, we shall also be discussing the other nuances and associated topics and also try to understand how to create answers from the prospective questions which can be raised from the topics and thereby help you prepare for the answer writing simultaneously. Now, the PDF of the entire session and the entire discussion shall be available on the Telegram channel, which you can download, and you will get the annotations of the PDF in a short duration as well. Now, today we are going to have a discussion for around 7 different topics in varying different lengths and details as is required for the examination. The first one that we will start with is the Center to resume talks with the Kuki Zoo insurgents. Now, that has appeared in the front page of the newspaper. Now, that is relevant for the portion of your internal security. So, this is very relevant for your portion of internal security, right? Now, after that, government eases procurement norms for research labs. Now, the government had brought in the GEM, the government e-marketplace, which had provided or which had proven to be a kind of an impediment by the scientists and by the researchers as they were unable to carry out the research in their fullest capacity. So again, the government has rectified the previous measures or has come up with a corrective notification, so to say, in order to ease the research conditions. So this is relevant for your portion of science. So, or you can put that under GS3, science and tech. Now, this is also something that you will find questions associated with this to be framed even in your essay paper about what is required for India to bolster and galvanize its research. So, that is again an area that you have to be mindful of where essay questions can also be asked. Now, government must tackle structural textile sector issues. Now, this is about the apparel and the textile sector, how the amount of exports have stagnated for a long period of time and why the structural issues need to be tackled. This has appeared in the business page. Again, the economic article, the article dealing with economy, or again, GS paper 3. Extreme poverty in India down to 5.3% in 22-23. That is something which has been a statement issued by World Bank. So the number of people or the population suffering from extreme poverty has come down by a large margin. So what is that? So this is relevant only for the prelims perspective. Now a drum app has been created by researchers at IIT in order to give you an ideal amount of pathway in order to reduce your exposure to pollution. So, what is that drum app? Again, relevant only for your prelims. World's rivers are leaking old CO2 into the air. So, this completely changes how we take a look at the CO2 absorption and release by the land sources as well, and the sinks and the sources of carbon dioxide that we have been thinking about till now, that seems to be upended completely. Now, Canada invites India for G7 after a lot of tussle and uncertainty about India not being invited to Canada for G7, which India was not expected to be invited for G7. Finally, Canada has managed to invite, and India has accepted that invitation, and the Prime Minister is expected to attend the G7 meet. With the help of this very brief look at G7, and we shall also be taking a look at the overall perspective of this G7 meeting in Canada and what is India's role going to be and why it can be relevant for India, but at the same time, it should not have been that very important to attend it in Canada. So these are some of the things that we are going to take a look into today. Starting with the first article of the day, that is Center set to resume talks with the Kuki Zoo insurgents. Now, after a long hiatus of almost a couple of years, the center has agreed to reinitiate the talks when it comes to the Kuki Zoo insurgents in the region of Manipur. Now, ever since the violence broke out in May 2023, since that point of time, the region of Manipur has been on edge. And there has been a lot of misgivings on all the sides regarding the role played by the state government, the role played by the central government, and all of them eyeing with suspicion the role played by the Maitis, the role played by the Kukis, and so. So, in the midst of all this uncertainty and the complete breakdown of law and order, so to say, in the region of Manipur, the one of the important pacts, that is suspension of operation pact, what is known as the SOO pact. Now that SOO pact was not renewed. So this talk which is being mentioned here and which is going to be reinitiated, that is going to revolve around the restarting of this SO pact. Now, for the uninitiated amongst us who don't have a background about what this SO pact is, let us first of all try to understand what is this SO pact, why it is important for the region. Then, after that, we will go ahead into understanding the Kuki Zomi condition and the ethnicity, the demand thereby, why is it that this pact was not renewed, and what can be the way forward, so that we get a comprehensive understanding of this article. Obviously, all of that is not mentioned in the newspaper, but you need to have that background if you need to understand this particular important article. This is relevant for your GS paper 2 and 3 as well. Now, when we talk about suspension of operations pact, SOO, now this was signed in 2008 and it is a tripartite agreement. When we say a tripartite agreement means what? Three parties are there on the table and all these three parties agree to a particular consensus, that is suspension of operations. The simple name, suspension of operations. So, under this agreement, it was basically arrived at, a consensus was arrived at, that first of all, who were the members or the parties of this SOO. So, as a consequence of a long pending violence and a long going violence in the region of Manipur, after a long period of time in 2008, the three parties, that is the center, Manipur government, and the 25 Kuki militant groups, they agreed to arrive at a consensus that there would be no further operations carried out and there would be initiation of a dialogue process. Now, when do you initiate a dialogue between an insurgent whose demand is, let's suppose, a separate autonomous territory, and a government who basically says that whatever you have to do under the aegis of the flag and the constitution of the country? When do you initiate the dialogue? The dialogue can never be initiated under the fog of violence or the fog of war. The dialogue can only be initiated if there is no further operation or aggression that any one of them, for example, the cookies might think that the center's action or the state government's action, they are aggressive towards them. So then that completely erodes the confidence. So there should be a cessation of any kind of operation from either sides. That is where the suspension of operation, that aspect, came into being. Now, under the agreement, the Kuki militant groups agreed to stop carrying out violent activities and return to the designated camps to be monitored by the security forces. And also, the Indian government will halt all its operations against the Kuki militants. This is the broader outcome of the SOO pact, that no violence from either side, no operation from either. Also, as I will show it to you and indicate to you later as well about the conditionalities of the pact. Under this, these designated camps and the Kuki militants thereby, they had to basically give up the arms, they had to live in those camps, and they would be given some stipend of around 6,000 rupees as well. Now, this is an agreement which gets renewed every year. Now, for the past couple of years, the state of Manipur, that the state government has backed out from this agreement. So that is where there has been a lot of misgivings on both sides. For example, under this agreement, the Kuki camps, they have to be restricted. As you can see, they have to return to designated camps to be monitored by the security forces. Now, what has happened ever since the cessation of this pact is that the cookies, they have been found to be setting up camps in various different areas, more particularly closer to the valley where you have the Maiti groups living. And the Maitis have also had a kind of a grievance that the Kukis, they are settling in the camps very close to our locations, and they are launching violence into the valley through these camps. Now, whether that is substantiated or not substantiated, that is a discussion for a different day altogether. But nonetheless, the reality on the ground is that setting up of these camps close to the mighty settlements, that has eroded the level of confidence and the trust. And that has put the region on a particular knife's edge as well. But before that, for those of us who are uninitiated about it, the Kuki Zoo, what is that group or the grouping referred to? So the Kukis belong to an ethnic group native to the Mizo Hills in the mountainous regions of southeastern Mizoram and the region of Manipur. Now, in the northeastern state, the Kukis are found almost in all the regions and all the states, barring the region of Arunachal Pradesh. And they come under the ST classification. Now, in the larger region, if you talk about the ethnic background of it, not the racial background is different, ethnic background is different. Many of the times we end up confusing them, we end up misspeaking about them, and that creates a lot of misgiving as well. Please understand, racial background is different. That is about the body feature, that is about the chromosomal features, etc. Ethnic background is the ethnicity of a particular individual, of a particular grouping, the belief systems, the regions, etc. So, the ethnic background, if you take a look at it, so the Chins of Myanmar and the Mizos of Mizoram are related to the Kukis and are together called the Zo. Many of the time, the Zomis as well. So, that is what forms the Kuki Zo population in the region. Now, as per the overall intentions of the Zomis and the Kukis, they wanted to establish a larger integral area or an autonomous region for themselves. And this is when initially some amount of factionalism and some amount of violence broke out within the communities. Because if you take a look at the larger area which the Kukis term as their homeland, now, this also coincides with the demand for the Naga groups to in order to establish the greater Nagalim or the region of the Naga autonomous territory. So that is where there was conflict amongst these individual parts and individual groupings. And that is when violent clashes started to begin between the Kuki Zomis and between the Naga groups. And this had its genesis in the 80s and carried on well into the 90s as well. That is when you basically had in 1996 the establishment of Zomi National Movement. The Zomi National Movement came into existence. Now, as a part of this national movement, they talked about the revivalist tendency or the revivalist requirement of the Zomi population. Now, in order to achieve that goal and objective, they set up the Zomi Revolutionary Army, ZRA. Now, this ZRA would carry out raids, plunder, etc., and they were armed groups as well. And that created a lot of issue in terms of the internal security of the region. That these groups and these armed insurgency created the northeastern region in many of the parts to be completely isolated from the remaining part of the country as well. They would not allow infrastructure development to happen. They would not allow vital rail links, etc., to happen. And that perpetuated a cycle of poverty, which in a way perpetuated the cycle of misinformation, which led to further armament of the region as well. It is a kind of a vicious cycle, which is not only restricted to this region, but is something whose pattern can be found across the globe. Anywhere where you have armed insurgents or armed groups, infrastructure development doesn't happen. The cycle of poverty kicks in, and once the cycle of poverty kicks in, people then they are fed with propaganda. It is easy to feed propaganda in that particular case, and eventually picking up arms becomes the only viable alternative. So that is something which had prevailed in the region and has prevailed in many parts of the world as well. Now, this ZRA was a nuisance in the region, the Zomi Revolutionary Army. Now, there was a need for cessation of operations and armed attacks against the security forces. And for that, the armed insurgents, they also said that, okay, we will surrender arms, but you also don't attack us. It should not be the case that we have surrendered arms and you kill us all. So that should not be the case. So in 2008, the ZRA along with the Kuki National Army and ZRA, along with the other multiple groups of the Kuki insurgents, they basically arrived at a tripartite agreement involving the Kuki groups, the Kuki Zomi group, including the central government and including the state government. So that is the background of the SOO Pact. Now, this SOO Pact does get renewed every year. Now, if you take a look at some of the terms of the SOO Pact, you will understand the requirement and the long term purpose, the strategic goal to be achieved by formulating this pact. So, the duration of SOO agreement is 1 year, but also extendable according to the progress of its implementation. To monitor the proper implementation, a joint monitoring group with members from all signatories have been formed. Now, according to the pact, the central and the state governments agreed that the security forces would not launch any operations against any of these groups. Now, another important part here is that the pact also required the group to abide by the Constitution of India, the law of the land, and the territorial integrity of Manipur. So, any of the demand, whichever demand they would put forward, that demand would be under the flag, under the Constitution. No separate autonomous region, no independent region. That demand would simply not be. Then, basically, camps and arms management. The militant should stay in the designated camps identified by the government. Arms should be kept in a safe room using a double locking system. The groups provided arms only to protect their camps and their leaders. Now, ever since the violence broke out and the cycle of violence broke out in the region of Manipur, obviously these arms had been looted and further armament has been done from the region of Myanmar. And that is what is thought or thought to be one of the reasons why the opposing factions have also started picking up arms, and it has led to a spiraling out of control of the violent surge in the region. Now, the cadres living in designated camps are also given a monthly stipend of 6,000. Now, ever since the agreement has been suspended, or even prior to that, ever since the outbreak of the violence in May 2023, this stipend has not been paid, it has been withheld. So, that is also a point of grievance for these Kuki groups as well. But also, the number of these designated camps, they have multiplied, they have almost doubled. Now, this is something which is problematic, which is touted to be problematic by the state and the central government as well, because this is increasing the level of insecurities that the Maitis are feeling in the region of the valley. Now, that is what has led to the suspension of the fact. Now, suspension of this particular pact. Now, this SOO pact had been periodically extended each year except February 29, 2024, when the Manipur government pulled out from this pact. Why did the Manipur government pull out of the pact? Because the Manipur government thought that the Kukis, they have already broken the pact, they have already taken up the arms, and they have already violated the conditions of the pact, that they will first of all not attack the security forces, they will have a kind of a peaceful existence, and their demands will be within the flag and the constitution. They thought that even the number of camps have increased, so that is why the Manipur government backed out of this SO pact. Now, one of the conditions that had been set forth for the further reinitiation of the pact was removal of SOO camps from locations close to the valley districts, which are dominated by the mighty. The security forces have also suggested that the number of camps be reduced from 14 to around 7. So that also reduction has to be done. Now, please understand that this talks which are being reinitiated, this is not immediately going to lead into a declaration, or this is not immediately going to yield a result. This is a reinitiation of the talks. So we have to understand that on the ground, there is a complete breakdown of confidence. Any of the group, they take a look at each other with a complete sense of suspicion that the other one is out there to harm them, be it the government, be it the mighties, be it the state government, anyone. So that is why, first of all, some confidence building needs to be done. In order to gain long lasting peace, confidence building measures are the bulwark upon which the entire structure is then built. So that is where these initial talks will be those confidence building and reinitiation of that identification. So once that is done, once that is laid, after that, the negotiation can be further carried out. So that is the case of the SO Act. I hope this is something which is clear and this is something which is understood. This is a developing story. With the passage of time, more developments are expected in this, and that is when you will get to know where this SOO Pact is going ahead. SOO Pact can also be relevant for your prelims. What is it related to, and which or whether it is a tripartite or a kind of any other kind of agreement. Okay. Now, after this, moving on to the second article. The second article is Government eases procurement norms for research labs. Now, on the face of it, this article says, or the article looks as if the government has further facilitated research as when we talk about the scientific labs and the affiliated labs. But the reality is something different. You see, in 2019, the government had brought about a certain notification and certain set of norms, whereby through its procurement platform, that is the government e-marketplace. Now, all the procurement needed to be done through government e-marketplace. Now, the purpose of bringing this norm was to improve or to focus upon the goal of Atmanirbharta, right, or self-sufficiency. So that is where you had the policy where if let's suppose you have a scientific lab, let's assume you are an individual A who has got a scientific lab. Now what you're trying to do in that lab is trying to recreate a kind of an experiment using fermions or some other kind of subatomic particles, the kind of experiment that has happened in Europe. You're trying to recreate it and observe the outcomes on your own in order to understand its implication and utilization as well. After all, recreation of certain experiments is very important in order to gain your own manifestations, in order to gain your own results. Only then will you have a further understanding of these scientific principles as well. Now, if you wanted to create that scientific experiment, obviously you would require certain unique kind of instruments as well, isn't it? Now, those instruments, where do you get them? Europe has carried out that experiment. Europe has got that scientific manufacturing basis and hub. Europe will have that, but we in India, we don't have that. So, can you import it? No. Under the new norms which were put forward in 2019, you had to basically apply at this portal, at the platform, government e-marketplace. Now you would have to wait for the vendors within the country to apply that whether they can supply you that equipment or not. In most of the cases, for high-end research purposes, it was found that Indian vendors simply did not have the wherewithal or the capacity to manufacture such equipments, or even if they had the capacity, they would not manufacture such equipments on a one-off basis. So that meant the only option left was import. You had to import it. Now, once it comes to import, the government looked down upon the import because it wanted to substitute the import, that everything should be procured domestically. We should not import anything. So that was the kind of a policy and a policy directive. So that would take further larger amount of time. Lot of questions would be asked. Why do you need to carry out this experiment? Is that experiment that important for your survival? And so on and so forth. So this would discourage the scientific community as well. And as a consequence, the overall scientific research, which is a key instrument for development in any of the sector that you think about, that scientific research was lagging behind. Now, you also have to understand that let's suppose once you have gone through all these loops and hoops and barriers and finally decided that I want to get something imported because that is a research which is vitally important. But then also it would not be easy. After that also, the kind of final authorization, even for small amount of material, would be provided from the secretary level. Now you can imagine, for example, in your organization or wherever you are, getting an approval from someone else automatically is tedious and time taking process. Getting an approval in the government of India is again a time taking process. Gov- Getting an approval from the secretary level in the Sarkar-e Hind, You can imagine the amount of time delays which would happen in certain cases. It was reported in the newspaper itself that the delays have mounted for around 6 to 8 months. So that delay is very, very massive, particularly for the scientific community. Now, think about it. You are planning for a kind of a research. You need the scientific equipments to validate your research. In the meanwhile, someone from China has already validated that research, patented that technology, then all your study for decades is now put to lurch and is put to bin. So that is a disadvantage. That should never happen. So, in order to remove this kind of a kink, iron out all these kind of discrepancies, the government has reverted to its old norm that if required, if you are not getting the scientific equipment, you can import it. Now, if you are amongst one of those scientific affiliations or scientific bodies which is affiliated to the Central Department of Science and Technology and so on, in that particular case, the head will have a greater allocation of fund as well, which they can automatically approve. They don't need to roll to the secretary of the Department of Science and Tech in order to get their approval. So the approval process has been streamlined, but along with the approval process, you also have the norms of import, etc. That also has been smoothened out. So this is basically better in terms of the scientific outlook which the country can have going ahead into the future. Okay. Now, what about the issues which are created basically in the scientific aspect and in the case of scientific decorum and medium? So let us talk about some of the issues. Basically, whatever we have discussed, let us encapsulate it in a point wise manner so that you also, if a question is asked in the mains examination, you also have a proper point wise answer that you can arrive at. So basically, when we talk about it, what are the issues which are created? One of the issue is basically lack of timely clearance. Now, where will this be important? In which portion will this be important? This will be important in those kind of questions where they talk about, or the questions almost every year in the mains examination, you find a question asking you about what is the or what are the ways which need to be followed, suggested pathways which need to be adopted in order to improve the R&D in India, in order to improve the R&D base in India. So that is something where you can provide these as a kind of issues that our country already face, right? So lack of timely approval, right? Then limited supply of scientific equipment, supply of scientific equipments for research within the country, lack of enough vendors, vendors in terms of domestic vendors. Then after that, you also have, in the case of the scientific community, the issues are also associated with the kind of clearances required. So that is where lack of autonomy for the bodies, big bodies. Sakshi, my dear, for English, please understand you have a separate channel for the Hindi medium and the bilingual. There also you will have the newspaper analysis. This is purely for the English medium candidates. So that is why here the discussion will have to be carried out in English medium. Any one of you who is appearing actually for the examination in English medium, I would advise you, please follow the newspaper analysis in English medium only. Otherwise, you might be able to clear the prelims, but when it comes to answer writing, you will be facing some amount of issue. But having said that, if we are more comfortable in bilingual, if we are more comfortable in Hindi language, you have the analysis going on in other channels for bilingual as well. Okay. Now, lack of autonomy for scientific bodies. Then after that, you also have substantial amount of red tapeism. What is red tapeism? Red tapeism is basically when you have a kind of bureaucratic hurdle, so to say, and where you have one layer after another where clearance needs to be taken, right? So you would have heard about the fact that the files keep on moving around the ministry for months and years before getting a final approval. So that is a kind of an inordinate delay which can always be avoided. So that is the case of red tapeism. Then lack of enough domestic vendors for scientific equipments. For scientific equipment. Also, one of the issues is limited budget. Limited budget. If you will have more budget as a scientific organization, think about it. It is a very logical point, easy to understand. If let's suppose you have more budget as a scientific organization, automatically what will it implicate? It will mean that you will carry out more scientific researches in your organization, more frequent researches in your organization as well. Now, once you carry out researches more frequently, as a consequence of that, there will be greater supply from your greater demand from your side. You will be demanding scientific equipments much more frequently from the market. So the vendors, they will think that, okay, for example, a capillary tube is in demand, so let's manufacture capillary tubes. Only then will you have the manufacturers of those particular scientific equipment as well, the pressure valve, etc. Otherwise, why will a vendor get into the supply or the manufacturing process if they know that only one article will be sold, or two at max three products will be sold? Why will someone enter into the production process? So that is why, in order to improve that domestic manufacturing, you need the domestic demand also. When will the domestic demand come into place? Domestic demand will come only when you have enough budget, and also when you have enough autonomy. So that is basically the case where you can increase the research and development. And also, one of the issues that this basic aspect of funds and the basic aspect of budget, please understand, when we talk about the GDP to, or the amount of GDP which is spent for research and development in India, it is an abysmal low percentage of less than 2%. Countries like Turkey, countries like South Korea, we are not even talking about China. Many of the other countries also, at a relatable economic level, they have been spending much more percentage of GDP on research as compared to what India has been spending. Now, what is the answer to it? Is the answer that the government should start spending more on research? Definitely yes. But where will the government spend more on research? The government will spend more on research through the IITs, through the IISCs, right? Through, let's suppose, the medical research, etc. That's it. That is the limited avenue through which the government can promote research. This is where the participation or the lack of participation of the private sector is a thing to notice. Because in majority of the countries which have developed, that research is fueled by the private capital, the industry. For example, let's suppose I am one of the automobile manufacturers. It is in my interest to develop the latest type of battery technology so that my vehicles will be the best in the market, isn't it? So I should spend some amount of money in research and development. It is in my interest to ensure that the easiest recycling of the lithium ion battery should be done at a fastest rate, because as a country, India has got a large generation of e-waste. So the private sector's contribution to research is particularly muted in our country. Yes, there is the scope of increased government spending in R&D, which is a fact. But at the same time, the private sector needs to step up. The result of this is something which is very apparent in the case of the defense sector. We have seen that in the defense sector. For example, take a look at our DRDO and HAL. Now, HAL has been developing the Tejas fighter, the LCA, Light Combat Aircraft Fighter, since the 80s. Till now, a full squadron strength of LCA Mark 1 has not been delivered, isn't it? Now, since 1980s, now you are in 2025. In the meanwhile, the look at the foreign countries. Now, when you take a look at companies like Boeing, when you take a look at companies like Northrop Grumman or a company like Lockheed Martin, now they were also working on third and fourth generation fighters in 1980s. Presently, they are working on sixth generation fighter jets, right? And advanced fighter jets. Where are we? We are still trying to cope up with the manufacturing of that three and a half or fourth generation fighter jet. Till now, we have still not managed to complete it. Even by most aggressive and optimistic of the estimates that we have, HAL would be able to provide that to the Air Force going into the 2030s. And by that point of time, the technology would have become so old that there would be time to decommission all of them, isn't it? Same is the case with DRDO. There are multiple such various different avenues where DRDO has been working for decades now. One is the case of Air Independent Propulsion System, AIP system. Now, this AIP system allows you to, in the conventional submarines, allows you to generate air inside water itself. Now, this is a system which is very important in order to gain stealthiness in the conventional submarines. They don't need to surface every couple of days. Now, think about it. DRDO has been on it for many decades now. Now, DRDO is saying we have developed it. In the meanwhile, even our adversary, that is Pakistan, much smaller economy, now they have got that system. So, where does it put us? So, this is the reality of the government backed research in our country. So, what we need is the private players to step up. And this is what we have already seen in the already or something which has recently culminated in the form of Operation Sindoor, where the various different kind of drones which were used, there many of the drones were from India's private sector. And that provided India with a kind of an operational edge, right? So, we do need both public and private sector to improve furthermore. And for that, we need the industry to research connect. Industry to research connect. And when will that happen? This will happen when industry connects with the institutes, the academia, many people you would also know in your life who have done MTech, who have done PhD, who have done masters in various different scientific fields, and their talent is not utilized. Eventually, after doing that MTech, after doing that masters, they are coming back to the non-scientific field. So that is a kind of a talent wasted. Why can't we harness that potential? Why can't the industry simply take up these individuals, upskill them if required, and provide that kind of technological prowess which is required by the nation? So here the problem becomes more systemic. You have the problem in terms of the curriculum which is being taught in these institutions, and all of that stems from what? All of that stems from the fourth, lack of autonomy. Everything is closely monitored and closely set. So that is where the private institutes, they don't have the autonomy to take, let's suppose, charge certain amount of fees or change their curriculum system and so on. So it is a kind of a systemic issue that our country is facing. Having said that, when we talk about this particular case of the government notification, now the government notification has eased up some of the issues and has eased up some of the problems which are being. But this has also put into news and has put into relevance the aspect of government e-marketplace, GEM. Now, what is this government e-marketplace? So, when we talk about GEM, this was launched way back in 2016. It is under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Now, this government e-marketplace, the purpose behind it was very simple: to streamline the procurement policy. Because prior to this, there was a kind of an understanding that wherever for the government any kind of procurement needed to be done, it was so disorganized. there would be repetition of the same order, there would be repetition and the repetition of the same vendors also. So there was a kind of a monopoly system about the vendors who would supply to the government and the government related orders. And mind you, government related orders are in the tune of lakhs and crores. They are not small thousands of rupees kind of tenders. So that is why the government came up with a kind of a platform which will be transparent, which will be easier to access, and where everybody can get the required amount of materials. So that was the basic purpose. So it is a paperless, cashless, and contactless online procurement platform used by government departments, PSUs, and the ministries to acquire the goods and services transparently and efficiently. So that is the case of the government e-marketplace. But the reality of the matter also is the fact that yes, the government e-marketplace has basically achieved a value of trillions of dollars of tenders, billions of dollars of tenders being granted. But at the same time, when you talk about scientific community, when you talk about very unique kind of research materials which are required, there is a limitation which is hit. There is a kind of obstruction. You don't have vendors. So that is the problem faced in certain sectors of G. So this GEM becomes relevant for your prelims examination. When was it formed? What is its purpose? And also, what is it and under which ministry? Okay. I hope this is again clear and understood. Now, a main type of question which can be framed from this. A nation's long term prosperity is inherently hinged to the comfort of its scientific community. Comment. 15 marker question, 250 words are required to be written in this. Now, again, as I had told you in the initial part also, this can be a topic which can be utilized even in your essay paper. So you should have the ability to weave an essay out of this also. So it is about the importance of R&D, importance of scientific research. If let's suppose the same topic is asked in the essay, you have to give the historical background as well, right? You simply don't have to start mumbling about government e-marketplace and your work is done. No, you have to talk about the importance of scientific research as older civilizations have indicated. Give examples of the Byzantines and the aqueducts. Give example of the gunpowder. Give examples of the defensive mechanism, the seven wall techniques. So scientific developments throughout history have yielded positive results. That is something that you highlight if you are writing an essay out of it. Okay. However, here we are not writing an essay, we are simply writing a simple answer. So when you are writing a simple answer, a nation's long term prosperity is inherently hinged to the comfort of its scientific community. Comment. Comment means what? You have to analyze this statement, talk about the statement, and eventually take your own stance as well. Yes, Persian wheel, all of that will come into. Yes, correct. Now, here, how do you start the intro? What do you write in the intro? Should you start about the nation's prosperity? That is also one way, but not an advisable. You should ideally start with the role or the importance of of science and the community. Okay, community. So you can start by saying that development of science in any particular region is paramount in order to gain superiority or sufficiency in terms of food, energy, and a general way and comfort of life. So, this is where you can talk about it, right? So, your introduction has to be brief, 20 to 25 words. That's it. Please don't enlarge your introduction to be 50, 60 words itself. 20, 25 words, give a break. After that, in the body portion, talk about the contributions of science. Very briefly, right? Brief contribution in nation development, in nation's development. Okay? Talk about it very briefly. Now, once you have mentioned that, mention various sectors, education. For example, let's suppose when you talk about digital technology, digital technology improves your ability to spread education and penetration of education to the lower level. Talk about, for example, satellite technology, VSAT, which is used for educational purposes. Then talk about the well being. Scientific research in pharmacy and medicinal science improves the and the standard of living and also life expectancy in general. Vaccines, vaccine development, defense tech, talk about all the sectors, right? Even let's suppose water purification technology that gets rid of multiple diseases like that, you talk about it. So once you have done that, because it is a 15 marker, that is when you talk about the challenges. That despite all these contributions, inherent contribution, the scientific community in our country faces certain amount of challenges. What are the challenges? Can we start the line that necessity is the mother of invention? Why? I mean, will it be usable there? No, right? So just because invention is there, don't use that. Okay. So before going directly into challenges, talk about the fact that despite all these positive contributions, the scientific community does face certain challenges, and challenges that we have mentioned, list them out. List them out in the form of a bubble or a kind of a flow chart, any which way where you can improve your presentations. List them out. After that, talk about the way forward. And that way forward can eventually merge with your conclusion, right? So, suggestion or way forward. So, that is where industry, academia connect, right? So, that is what is required. Upskilling of the labor force that is required, greater autonomy needs to be provided. Eventually, when you write the conclusion, talk about it. The basic survival and long term prosperity of a nation is dependent on the well being and utilization of the human capital of its citizens. Unless and until the citizens have the scientific backbone to help them grow, the nation's growth in itself will be stymied going ahead into the future. So, if we dream for a prosperous and an advanced superpower that we call India, the need of the hour is to make scientific community not only comfortable but aspirational. With that, you can end the and conclude your answer, and you will get good amount of marks. Try to write the answer on your own. Take a look at it and get it evaluated. Right now, then coming on to the next article. Now, this is associated with a kind of an inherent issue which has been there in the textile apparel sector for a long period of time. Neutral stance is the only considered as a way forward? No. Way forward is this is the problem. What can be done going ahead into the future? Right? Way forward cannot be that, yes, the government is bad. They have not paid attention to it. That government was also not good. They had also not paid attention to it. Make me the prime minister, see how the scientific community advances. That is not the way forward. Way forward is if there is lack of autonomy, provide autonomy. If there is lack of industry institutional connect, provide that. That is the way. What is your solution that you will provide? That is the way forward. Okay, it is not about the case of negative or the positive connotation. Okay, right. Even if you criticize, criticism is okay. Criticism should be provided, but it should be positive criticism. It should be that this can be done, this can be, or this could be done, right? Or it should not be the case that they are mad that they are not following this suggestion. Don't take that stand. If you have that kind of an opinion, write it on a piece of paper, in a glitter pen or in a red pen, fold that paper, keep it in a cupboard, lock that cupboard. But when you are writing answer for UPSC, don't bring that opinion to the answer page. Okay? Now, government must tackle structural textile or apparel sector issues. Now, when we talk about the textile sector or the apparel sector, now in this particular case, there has been a long term issue whereby there has not been any sufficient amount of reforms. Even though there have been some amount of reforms which have been initiated at certain state level or maybe at the central level, but overall the reality of the matter is that the textile and the apparel sector, which at one point of time used to dominate our export basket, that has stagnated. Now, once that has stagnated, the impact is substantial. See, there can be multiple ways to look at it. Let's suppose my apparel export was $100 billion, right? Which is not the case, which is our dream. But let's suppose rather than 100 billion, let's go for $10 billion. Now, for a long period of time, it has stagnated to $10 billion only. So, any which way that you take a look into it, the share of apparel and textile sector is declining in our export basket, right? So that means the sector will get less attention, isn't it? So this is the case of the textile sector. Over a long period of time, it has been found out that the export from the textile sector has been hovering around 37 billion to around $42 billion. There have been multiple reasons for that. And in the recent times, you have countries like Bangladesh, where the textile sector has grown rapidly, and they have overtaken us in terms of the textile export in certain sectors, in certain key markets. It is also the case that the Bangladeshi exporters, they send their materials through India in order to evade some amount of tax duty as well. And that is something that India has rectified in the past month or so. But nonetheless, the textile sector, the aim is to take the amount of exports from the textile sector to around $100 billion, $100 billion by 2030. We are at 37 to $42 billion. The value is consistent. And the volume of export that we are doing from the textile, volume of export, that is declining. Right. Now, in order to attain this high amount of export value, we need to develop at least at a rate of close to around 17% annually. That amount of growth is required annually. But then the sector faces certain set of issues which are structural in nature. What are those structural issues? First, we will take a look into that. Then we will take a look into why is it that we need to pay significant attention to the textile sector. Why can't we just be happy that, okay, textile sector is stagnant, mobile exports are increasing, so defense exports are also increasing, so we should be happy in that? No, textile sector is very, very important for us. Why? We'll take a look into it. But first, the structural issues which are faced. First of all, the raw material prices. The raw material prices, they fluctuate drastically. Raw material for the textile sector, cotton bales, for example, the jute fabric, etc. That raw material, the prices fluctuate, and there is a kind of a strict regulation on whether you can import or not. So the reality of the matter is that in our domestic market, many of the times the supply of materials like jute becomes so problematic. It is cheaper and easier to import it from Bangladesh, right? But the companies have, the textile sector has got a regulation, they have got a limitation, they have got a restriction of import export. So that is why they are bound, they are forced to buy raw materials from a set marketplace. And that is when the price increases and the price of the finished product will also rise. That is when your product in itself becomes so costly, it becomes incompetitive in the international market. Then the labor cost is also very high. The lack of mechanization over the years in the textile sector has meant that the production process not only is slow, inefficient, and the labor cost is substantially high. For a long period of time, for decades though, please understand, we are a country where textile production has led to the industrialization of some of the important industrial zones that you have in our country. Of the major industrial zones that you have in our country, the Bombay Pune industrial zone that started with cotton textile, the region of the Hooghly industrial zone that started with the setting up of the jute textile mill at Rishra way back in 1855. When we talk about even the Bangalore industrial zone extending all the way to western Tamil Nadu, there also it was a silk textile and the cotton textile which started developing. So textile sector has been a backbone of development of many of the industrial zones, but lack of technology updation, that has remained the case. due to which the sector has remained labor intensive, relying on older technology, so production will obviously be less. Cost of capital is also high. The amount of capital, the value or the interest that you pay for borrowing capital, that is also very high. Tech is low, increased competition from the other neighboring countries, right? This is also a problem, right? So, other than that, you also, yes, fragmented supply chain. So, these are also some of the cases. So, these are some of the structural issues which are faced. But why is textile sector important? Textile sector is important because it is, again, labor intensive. Labor intensive means what? Large amount of labor force is deployed there. When you have large amount of labor force deployed there, so their income is dependent on the well-being of the sector. If the sector is not performing well, they will earn less. If they will earn less, they will spend less. That will impact the rural and the urban demand. Creation of a larger sector of urban poor, which is happening in many areas, that is particularly attributed to the poor performance of the textile sector also, right? So vital for demand in the economy. It is a very important export sector where we are targeting $100 billion of export within a decade. And please understand, the well-being of textile sector is also something which will determine the demand for your cotton bales, right? Large amount of the country, for example, the Saurashtra region, the region of the Deccan Traps, Malwa Plateau, everywhere large amount of cotton production does happen. Now, lot of farmers are dependent on that. Now, the demand for cotton will be dependent on the well-being of the textile sector. So that is why there is a downstream linkage for the agricultural products as well. So that is why the textile sector needs to perform. Now, how will it perform? It will only perform if you have some regulatory mechanisms which are brought in. You already have some of the government schemes like the Sfurti, right? Which is basically about technology upgradation. Okay, you have the power looms which are being provided. But again, that is restricted. This is where both the central and the state government should work aggressively for technology upgradation. And also the turnaround time. What is the turnaround time? When the demand is placed and when you are supplying the final product. So that turnaround time, that has to be reduced. And that will be happening only when you have increased mechanization. So that is where India need not only reclaim its position as one of the top textile exporters across the world, but also overcome its competition in the surrounding. Okay. Now, let us take a look at the practice question. Discuss the importance of addressing the structural issues in the textile sector in India. This is a 10-marker question. Here, the intro should also be simple because it is a direct question. So, in the intro, what is the phrase that you will target? Textile sector and the importance of textile. Textile sector is important, is or rather textile sector is a labor intensive sector which provides employment to millions of population, which inherently is linked to the urban and the rural demand in Indian economy. That in itself can be your brief and vital introduction. Then after that, when you talk about the body, so that is when you address parts of the question. First part of the question, the issues. What are the issues? So the textile sector in our country faces certain inherent issues. So then you mention the issues, and then why is it important? So that is where importance of addressing the, okay, solution is not asked. Solution to those issues is not asked. Importance of addressing the issues. So that is when in the second part of the body, importance of textile sector. After that, if you have space, after writing all this, then follow the 70-30 rule that we talked about. 70% of your answer, which is directly asked, 30% of your answer, which is linked to the topic but might not be directly asked. So that is when, in the remaining part, along with the conclusion, suggest certain way forward, right? Technology upgradation, then upskilling of the labor force, keeping up with the global trends, establishing a unified market, all that should be done in order to bring prosperity amongst the millions who are dependent on the sector directly or indirectly. Okay, so like that, you can conclude. Okay, now after this, we come to certain topics relevant for your prelims. Now, this is a very large article which has appeared in the science and tech section. But again, you don't need to be concerned about the length of the article. It is about a new app which has been developed by researchers at IIT Kharagpur, whereby they have come up with a drum app. Now, this app is basically in order to address the kind of vehicular pollution that people face. Because all of us are aware that in our country, the amount of pollution that we end up interacting or that we end up experiencing, that substantially alters our expected life cycle and also brings about the possibility of respiratory and various other cardiovascular diseases. So the standard of living that tends to reduce. Having said that, the need of the now when we talk about pollution, there are various different sources of pollution, but one of the most easiest exposure to air pollution is the vehicular pollution. That is when you are moving on the roads and you have a kind of one of those blasting vehicles moving right next to you, giving all the taste and the smell of all the various individual gases, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, all of them, they are into your lungs. So that is in order to address this issue, a drum app has been established. So for you, for your requirement of the prelims, all that is required is what is this drum app. So basically, drum is dynamic route planning for urban green mobility. Okay, that is the drum app. Now what is the purpose of the app? So basically it gives users five route options: the shortest route option, the fastest route option, leap option, least exposure to air pollution, and liquor option, least energy consumption route, and the combination of all four factors in a suggested route. So in order to simplify it, let's suppose this is a route that you take. This is your home and this is your office. Now, this is the route that you take normally. But this is a route which is heavily congested with traffic. Heavily congested with traffic means there will be a lot of air pollution as well. So, as your vehicle will enter this route, it will, the app will, with the help of the tracking positions, it will monitor the amount of emission within that route. So, it will suggest you an alternative. It might take a longer period of time, but is an alternative nonetheless, where the exposure to air pollution will be less. Now, that is not something which will be suitable for everyone because this will also increase your fuel consumption if you are taking a longer route. But if you want to save yourself from pollution, that is your main criteria, then this will come to. This will also help in reducing the overall traffic congestion in the urban areas, which is a major problem for all the urban cities that we have, be it Bangalore, be it Mumbai, be it Chennai, everywhere, urban congestion is a problem that we have to deal. So, what is the DRUM app? What is it associated with? So, for greener mobility, for uh, assuaging the problem associated with air pollution. Okay. Now, then, World Bank has come up with a report whereby it has said that extreme poverty in India has declined to 5.3% in 22-23. Now, this is a comparison report. So basically, as per the report, in 2011-12, the amount of absolute poor population, extreme poverty population in India was around 27.1%. Right? Now, this was taken at a daily wage rate, which was around basically at that point of time, it was much lesser. At that point of time, it was $2.15 per day. So, anyone who was earning less than $2.15 per day was put under this extremely poor category in 2011 2012. Now, the same data has indicated that in 2022 23, that number of absolute poor has come to 5.3%. Now, obviously, during this period of time, inflation has also happened. So, accounting for inflation, now the limit is $3 per day. If you are earning anywhere less than $3 per day, then you are put under absolute poor or extreme poor category. So this shows a remarkable decrease or decline in the amount of absolute poor, right? Extreme poverty rate basically slid from 16.2% to 2.3% as well. So that has been a decline in the overall poverty rate when we talk about India. Now, world's rivers are leaking old CO2. The, now, basically, when we talk about carbon dioxide, we know that carbon dioxide has got certain sources and has got certain sinks. It has got certain sources, it has got certain sinks. Sources which emit CO2, sinks which absorb CO2. Now, when we talk about land, a well forested land is something which is treated as a sink of CO2, forested land, right? Like that, similarly, water is also treated as a sink of CO2. Now, researchers have indicated or have found out that basically the rivers, when they are moving, now the rivers many of the times have trapped a lot of CO2 over the period of years, and that is deposited in the vegetation, etc. Now, that CO2, older CO2, is being released continuously by the rivers as well, right? Because there is that scientific aspect associated that older CO2, which has been created much earlier, right? Hundreds of years ago. Older CO2 has more, or rather less, carbon 14 as compared to newer CO2, compared to new CO2. Okay? Less C14. So it is easy to detect. C14 is basically used for carbon dating and deciphering the age as well. So that is why older CO2 has got less C14. So you are able to detect that older CO2 is based upon the C14 amount and composition. You are able to detect whether newer CO2 is being released or older CO2. So it has been found that the rivers have been releasing that older CO2, which again puts into question our known assumption of the sources and sinks of carbon dioxide, which it is a kind of a new emission source now that we are seeing. So that again puts the importance of afforestation, reforestation, and vegetation cover across the regions of the rivers to be very, very vital. Planting trees across the riparian buffers and across the embankments again becomes very. Now, coming to the last article of the day, Carney defends his plan to invite Modi to G7, says India is the fifth largest economy. Now, basically, uh, the G7 summit this time is being held and hosted by Canada. Now, Canada had not put up the invite to India for some time. Now, India was also not expecting the invite because it was being held in Canada. And all of us, I hope, are aware that the diplomatic relations between India and Canada have taken a downspin ever since you had Justin Trudeau alleging Indian involvement in the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Since that point of time, and since the time that the pointing was so particular, that higher level, and they pointed fingers at individual ministers and higher levels of the government. Now both the countries, they withdrew high commissioners from each other, right? So we don't even have the high commissioners in each other country. So that has been the case of a diplomatic background. So in that kind of a backdrop, India did not expect an invite, and India was very much okay with that fact, because participating in that G7 obviously was not something which was very relevant when you talk about the Canadian relations as well. But the reality of the matter is also the fact that India is the fifth largest economy of the world, the largest population of the world. Now, in G7, the discussion which hover around climate actions of global supply chain partnerships, etc., you cannot carry out that dialogue and that discussion ignoring the most populous and now the fourth largest economy of the world. You cannot ignore India. So that is why Carney has extended the invitation to India, and Prime Minister has accepted that invitation. Now, why is it that the Prime Minister has accepted the invitation when India was not expecting it? Why is it that India is eager to participate in that? This has to be seen at a larger geopolitical lens as well. One of the reasons which is being cited by the analyst is the fact that yes, we are a part of the larger global table and we are a responsible member of the Global Committee of Nations. It is our role to play a responsible partner when it comes to trade negotiations, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to critical mineral supply. But simultaneously, another aspect which has drawn attention to is the fact that presently we are at a critical juncture where we have our group of MPs traveling across the world highlighting India's stance against its war on terror. India's war on terror is at a vital stage. And that is where the awareness and the application across the global community, or rather, the urging across the global community, has to gain a foothold. So, this is a kind of a platform, a so called elite platform, where the G7 nations will meet, will convene. And those G7 nations, India can make its stance clear. And this is something that you will see. Even in the statement that is issued on that G7 platform, mark my words, India will use the phrase of terrorism and the aspect of terrorism to make the world aware of the problems that we are facing back home. Now, for your prelims, it is relevant for you to be able to know what is that aspect of G7. It started initially as G6 in 1975, consisting of basically the criteria would be large important economies which were democracy. That would be the criteria, consisting of the US, France, Italy, Japan, UK, and West Germany, right? Now, Canada joined the group 1 year later, leading to the transformation as G7, and Russia joined the group in 1997, making it G8. Right? The European Union has been participating. EU participation has been there since the 1980s itself. Now, Russia was what made it G8. But ever since its annexation of Crimea in 2014, Russia has been removed and this has remained 7. Now, G7 has been losing its relevance in the recent times owing to the fact two most populous nations of the world, India and China, are not a part of it. The second largest economy of the world and the fourth largest economy of the world, that is again India and China, they are not a part of it. Right? So, in many of the ways, G7 still is a relic of the old world order pre Second World War. That is why the relevance and the aspect of G7 in itself is put into question. That is why groupings like BRICS, etc., they are becoming more relevant with the passage of time. Okay, so that is where we'll limit the discussion for the day. I hope we have gained some valuable insights in the discussions that we have had. Now, try to write the answers on your own. If you have liked the content, please put that in the comment section and don't forget to click on the like, share, and the subscribe button. Till we meet again, take care. Goodbye. Thank you.